Many of us, if not all of us, work, and many people who work have a disability. And so today we're going to talk about how, as a person with a disability, you can interact with your work environment, you can interact with your colleagues, the complexities, some of the nuances of that, and where to go if you're looking for more information. My name's Kona with Disability Rights Montana, and today with me I have David, our Executive Director.
Hey, Kona.
Hello.
Hi, everyone out there.
And today we're going to talk about how to talk about your disability in the workplace. We will get to reasonable accommodations and maybe some more specifics in a little bit. But first, I kind of wanted to start with just defining what a disability can be.
Sure. Well, I think that's an interesting question because, and I'm sure we'll get into this in other episodes about like different ways of thinking about disability, because I don't believe disability exists as an immutable thing that doesn't change, that is out there, that has truth behind it. It is a construct in my mind, and I think you can construct it different ways. So I think in the workplace, a lot of times we talk about, do you legally have a disability? So that's one way of constructing the concept of disability is there a law that protects me? Is there a law that describes my existence in some fashion? You could also, disability is often thought of through a medical lens. But I also think it's important when thinking about this to think about, how does the social lens of disability, or how does your relationship with disability on just a social level, how does that come into the workplace too? But so certainly I think I have less interest in the medical side of it, but I think legally and socially we're looking at disabilities under the law. Do you have a substantial impairment to a major life activity? Do you have a record of that, like a history? Or does someone think you have that? Well, then then we're in the legal realm of, do you have a disability?
And those three aspects, those were that you just listed, are part of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, and that would be the when you say legal definition of disability, our modern framework for that would be
right. And there are multiple what they call titles or sections of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the first one is Title I. Covers employment generally, and Title II covers state and local governments and their responsibilities, and that includes their employment practices. So that's sort of the world most people are in. But there is also the Rehabilitation Act, which covers federal folks and federal programs, federal contractors. Mm-hmm. So there are multiple areas you can look for law, including your local, state level, city level. Cities can provide greater protections than the states do. States can provide greater protections than the feds do. So there isn't sort of one size fits all. Depending on where folks are watching this from, they might be covered by entirely different laws. If they're in the U.S., obviously those federal laws, but depending on what town they're in, there could be some other protections.
So when we think about under, let's say for most people listening in or watching this, the federal law, the ADA, the Rehabilitation Act, and the Rehabilitation Act came before the ADA in the 70s.
Yeah, it was the first law to say, hey, us as the feds, we're not going to discriminate against people with disabilities, and the people who get a significant amount of money from us can't either.
And so are there differences in the types of disabilities covered from the Rehabilitation Act or covered from the ADA?
I mean, for the most part, the Rehab Act and the ADA are read pretty similarly. The language is pretty similar. There are some slight differences here or there throughout, but if you're thinking about do I have a disability that qualifies for disability protections in employment, I think the best thing to do is there are some really good resources put out by Department of Justice who enforces the Americans with Disabilities Act, and Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which enforces employment side discrimination. Those resources can walk anyone through, and you can sort of apply your own experiences in life, because the thing about disability is it's so varied. I mean, my experience is going to be very different than your experience. It's going to be very different than anyone else's experience. So, just trying to take a very fact-specific application, look at who's my employer, how big are they? Because if you work for a very small employer, you might not be covered by the federal law, but you might be covered by a local state law. So, it's always best to try and double check those. And we'll leave some resources down below so people can easily click on those and say, hey, how do I apply, how does this law apply to me? I live in Bozeman. I don't know what Bozeman has, if they have a unique ordinance. I'm new to Montana. So I'll learn that soon enough and say, oh, you live in Bozeman? You should probably check out this ordinance. And if Bozeman, you don't have an ordinance, why don't you think of creating one? You can always, like I said, you can always do better than whatever the bare minimum the feds and the state put out there.
And that bare minimum, just to reiterate, is the ADA, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973.
Yeah.
So the those two are the minimum. All states, no matter what state you're in, listening to this,
Territories too.
Territories as well, U.S. territories, they all should be following those rules.
Yep.
So now, maybe specifically, what types of disabilities, and I want to make sure that folks know everyone's jobs are different. People work in varied environments, whether you're working at a desk, whether you're working at a restaurant, whether you're working heavy machinery, out in the weather. Everyone's got all sorts of different jobs. So in putting that maybe to the side for a second, what are what types of disabilities could
what could be a disability?
What could be a disability?
I years ago wrote a brief to the Washington State Supreme Court talking about why it's a bad idea for Washington State to adopt the ADA as its floor for definition of disability, because there used to be a ton of litigation around, is this even a disability? Then in 2008, the Americans with Disabilities Act was amended to make it easier, and there's a lot less litigation about what is or is not a disability. But you could have an intellectual disability, you could have a physical mobility related disability, like you use a cane or a walker or a wheelchair, or you just can't walk for more than maybe 25 feet without being extremely winded, or you can't maybe you need to be able to sit down while you're working at the cash register. Like, there's really no reason you can't do that, right? But so that's where you get into that accommodation world, but not being able to stand for a very long time. Again, we're looking at a major life activity like walking, reproduction, breathing, your endocrine system, your immunity. Those are all major things in your life. If you have a substantial limitation to one of those, if you have to change the way you exist in the world compared to how the world is typically designed, that's kind of where we get in that disability world. The world is designed for people whose bodies and minds work this way, and mine works a little different. So yeah, it could be dyslexia, it could be a mental health condition. There are a variety of things. It's just, does your body or mind work in a way that maybe isn't fitting in with how your employer would like you to, and therefore you need an accommodation or something like that.
And we may get into this in a future episode, the differences between an invisible disability and a visible disability, because the things you just listed, some of them, if you were walking down the street, you might be able to visibly see someone who uses some kind of technology to, whether it's a wheelchair or a white cane,
communication device,
communication device.
Yep.
If in some disabilities you can't see, mental illness, anxiety, all these other invisible disabilities. Now, the timeline for those are different for everyone. You can enter the disability community at any point in time.
Sure, yeah.
And so some people are born into the disability community, whether they use that word or not, or whether their family structures know it or not. The disability community might say, you're part of the disability community, but other people can also enter the disability community later in life for a variety of reasons.
Yeah. And I mean, like, you could do a real deep dive. And I think that starts getting into that social model of disability and cultural conceptions. And as you're talking about family and how much do you relate to the disability community versus legally you're covered, and those are the two kind of, I'll say, different ways of looking at this, although, there's some overlap there. But, and I think for this topic of talking about disability at the workplace, there are going to be differences between do you have a disability other people notice, and do you have a disability that other people don't immediately notice or immediately label as disability. They may notice that David talks and acts with a different type of energy or a different sort of, because I do. Like I think differently than a lot of people do. You might see that ramifications of that, but you don't know, oh, David has dyslexia. You might not know that, like, I've got a congenital heart defect that impacts. Like, so earlier you were talking about, like, every job is different. Like the reason that I have a sit down job is I knew early on, I used to be a cook before I became a lawyer, and a legal manager, I was a cook. And I was like, I love cooking, but I can't do this the rest of my life. I can't stand, for 8, 10, 12-hour shifts. I know I can do that in my 20s, but by the time I get to this age, I can't do that because my heart won't let me do that. So those are considerations I make. Now, how do I talk about those with folks? And, it wasn't impacting me in my 20s, but it certainly would be today if I were a cook, or I was trying to do something else that required I stand as opposed to sit. And I'll eventually talk you into getting us some swivel chairs. I can fidget a bit too. But that was also on my list. I needed a job I could sit down, and if it was sit down and it was on a swivel chair, then I knew it was not sitting at a factory line. It didn't require a lot of stamina because people with swivel chairs have cushy jobs. So, I'd like a swivel chair.
Well, in whether it's a job with a swivel chair or in a factory setting, what are the processes for starting this conversation with an employer? If I am, whatever job I have, maybe we can take the office job, for example, first, since we work in an office, we can maybe relate to that right away. I work in an office. I have a disability. I know that I have a disability. What's my first step to say, or what, maybe not even my first step, but what's something that might happen that might trigger me to say, oh, maybe I need to have a conversation with someone?
I've talked to a lot of folks over the years about this because I hope I'm a relatively safe person to talk to about this. So people often come to me, it's like, I'd like to come out about my disability at work. You got any ideas? And first is you've come to that conclusion. Like, I think it's safe to do that, or I think I kind of need to. So I think that's the initial part is, do you really need to? And do you want to? It may be that the need is so great, it doesn't really matter if you want to. Like, I need an accommodation. I need work to change a bit in order for me to succeed here. Or it's just, no, work's going fine, but I feel like bringing my whole self to work and really operating from the power of my lived experience is necessary. And I can only do that if I talk to people about how I show up in the world. So I guess that's the first step.
So the first step is to realize,
make a conscious decision.
Make a conscious decision to that you do need something.
Right. Or whether the need is work related or work related in like I need to get my job done and it will help me get my job done, or it's I need to relate to people and I can do my job better if I am me. And
so what I'm hearing there is it could be two different things. It could be something procedural that is maybe just a process change. Like, oh, I need to do, if instead of doing A, B, C, if I can do B before A, and it doesn't affect the end product, then great. Like, that could be that could be a conversation to have.
I think a really good there are tons of good examples, right? But is, does there need to be a rule change like a process change? The rule is everybody who has this job needs to have a driver's license. Well, that cuts out a ton of people with epilepsy or vision-related disabilities, or people who have disabilities that are entering the workforce but don't have enough money to drive, people who maybe have intellectual disabilities. There are many groups of disabled people who have greater barriers to driving than non-disabled people or people with other disabilities. So you might say, my MS has progressed to the point that I can't reliably use my hands, and I don't want to drive. I don't think that's safe.
Mm-hmm.
And it's episodic. Maybe who knows? Maybe 6 months from now, my arms will work better. But in the meantime, like, I can still have the job, right? Like, oh yeah, you can get there by Uber. You can take a bus. How often do you really go out of the office? And usually, when you do, you're going with somebody else. And like you'd work with your employer to say, I don't meet this. What you said in the past was an actual work requirement, but it doesn't need to be a requirement. You should be looking for things that you might want to change around that. Now, or like you were saying, maybe it's about resequencing or changing a schedule. It could be, I take a particular medication, and when I come into the office, I'm still a little groggy by 9, but if I could start my day at 10, I'd be here 100% and like ready to go. It's like, well, if that's easier for you and we get 100% of you, win-win. Yes, of course, come in at 10. And now that's not always possible everywhere. I mean, we're talking about the office environment right now, and what is possible in one area may not be in another. But I think one thing we found from the pandemic is what employers used to say was not possible is possible. It's just not what they wanted. And so let's lean into that and say it was possible to modify how you approach this. It was possible to work remote. It was possible to not show up in a space with 60 people crammed into a room, and maybe I could sit somewhere else where I don't have the anxiety of being around all those folks or all the stimulus from that. Like, whatever it is that would help you perform better, being able to point out there, I can still get all my job done, and I can probably do it a lot better for you. And if you let me change what you've set up as relatively arbitrary rules, I really think people are looking for tips on how to come out generally in a social standpoint, from a social standpoint, that may also include legally, because they want to talk to their employer about changing some rules. And the advice I usually give there is try and find somebody that you feel is safe to come out to before you come out to everybody, and talk it through with them. Sometimes I'm that person, but sometimes I'm not working at the same place. I don't know the dynamics of what's going on there. So I suggest, like, is there a coworker? Is there a supervisor, maybe a former supervisor you had who'd get it and be able to help you think about navigating the political realities of your workplace and the all the relationships that are there. And that, I've talked to judges and lawyers and managers and, entry level people who this is their very first office job. And they're like, oh, I don't know how any of this is working. And there's like, you got some tips? And so there's also just some other practical tips that maybe if you can find some support, people can help talk through, so that when you do those things with you, so that when you do talk to your employer and you're in that interactive process, you've already thought of some ideas about, like, well, I know that, 5 years ago, John had a modified schedule that isn't too different than what I'm looking to do because he told me.
So maybe you see some examples, whether that's in your own workplace, a friend's workplace. You might come with an example and just start the conversation. It's just, if you need something, ask, find someone who's trusted. And start a conversation.
And if you're looking for ideas of, like, I don't know if I can make this, because I know, like, when I first started working an office job, I'd done a number of jobs that were not in an office, and it required sitting and reading for 8 hours a day. And I've got dyslexia. I can't do that. Like, I wasn't sure if I'd be able to keep doing this job. And if I can't, I just relocated my family to another city, and I went through all this debt to become a lawyer and take out loans to do that. And now what's going to happen? Like, I can't be a lawyer. But you can, again, ask around. And if you don't have someone because I didn't know anyone I could ask. You can go to what's called the Job Accommodations Network, JANS, and the JAN website, which we'll link below, has an incredible array of just ideas. Like, not all of them are going to work for you, but they'll be like, oh, they've got a big matrix that lists a bunch of different types of disabilities. You just click on, oh, this one, I got this one. What does this say? It suggests like, I never thought of that. Yeah, that could work. And so depending on your work environment and the way you process information or the way you physically show up in the world, they might have some good ideas on what you can do there. But I think a combination of that, like mind opening, like, oh, here are all these ideas, and someone that has done a similar job or is actually one of your coworkers could really help flesh out, no, this is totally doable. I've seen it work before, or other people have seen it work before. Another thing that employers often are worried about is this going to cost a lot of money? I think you'll find most of this is just changing a rule here or there. It's not a huge money suck. And so by doing a little bit of homework on that front early on, you can address some of the initial concerns that maybe the employer hasn't ever thought through. They should have, but not every employer has. So it's unfortunate, but a lot of times we have to educate our employers about our existences because they haven't thought about them that much.
Well, this is great. I think this is a great place to start. We've covered a lot of different areas. We were talking about jobs. We've mentioned a lot of other different terms. But if you're looking for more information about reasonable accommodations, think you might have a disability. If you're in the state of Montana, you can always call our office, contact us, send us an email. I'd be happy to chat with you. If you're out of state, you have the ability to contact your local state resources to include any protection advocacy program in your state. There's an organization like ours in every state and territory in the U.S., and they are typically a hub of extremely useful information for the disability community. And with that, thanks for being here, and we will see you soon. Thanks for being with us here today. If you want to know more about disability culture or civil rights for people with disabilities, go ahead and click some of these other videos we have going on, and we'll catch you on the next one.